My friends, have you ever truly listened to the silence between your own thoughts? Not the manufactured silence of a quiet room, nor the forced stillness of an anxious mind trying to escape itself, but that vast, immeasurable silence that appears when the mind is no longer chasing, no longer resisting, no longer naming. It is there, like a hidden river beneath the noise of our daily existence, a river that has always been flowing, timeless, untouched. And perhaps on this ordinary morning or evening when you happen to be watching this, you may sense it a whisper just behind your own heartbeat. I am not telling you what silence should be. I am not describing an ideal, a technique, a conclusion. I am only inviting you to observe without any desire to reach something. For the very desire to reach is the barrier itself. So let us begin this journey not as teacher and disciple, not as authority and follower, but as two human beings walking together through the terrain of the mind. For if one leads and the other follows, there can be no freedom. And without freedom, the mind cannot awaken. The noise within. Look at your own mind for a moment. Don't analyze it. Don't judge it. Simply look. You will notice it is full of noise. Not merely the noise of the outside world traffic, voices, music, endless notifications, but a much deeper noise, the chattering of thoughts, endless movement, a commentary that never seems to stop. Why did he say that? Will I succeed? What if something goes wrong? What should happen next? Am I enough? Thought is always operating from yesterday, from memory, from the known. Thought is like an old machine that keeps repeating its patterns, turning its wheels even when there is nothing left to grind. Have you seen an old fan continue spinning even after you switch it on? The blades keep moving out of habit, out of momentum. Our minds are very much like that, so long as the mind is caught in this rotation. How can it ever perceive silence, not the silence of inactivity, but the silence of complete awareness, the search for silence? Perhaps you have tried to meditate. Perhaps you have closed your eyes, sat upright, controlled your breath, repeated a mantra, hopeful that a quiet mind might appear. But the moment you try to become silent, you are no longer silent. Just watch a pond. When you toss a stone into it, even the desire to calm the water creates ripples. So you see, silence cannot be achieved. It can only be allowed, and it is allowed only when the mind sees without choice, without effort, that all its noise, all its struggle, all its searching is futile. Then something extraordinary happens. A natural stillness arises, not enforced, not manufactured. It is like dawn gently spreading across the sky, not because you command it, but because the night has reached its end. The awakening of intelligence when there is silence. A different kind of mind begins to operate. Not the mind that reacts, compares, imitates, not the mind that seeks security in beliefs or patterns, but a mind that is awake, fully attentive. You know, there is a flame that burns without smoke. It burns cleanly, brightly, without leaving residue. In the same way, there is an intelligence that functions without conflict, without fear, without the pressure of becoming something. This intelligence awakens only in silence. But silence is not withdrawal. It is not escaping from the world. It is not hiding in a cave or isolating yourself from responsibility. The silent mind is extraordinarily alive, extraordinarily sensitive. It hears everything, sees everything, feels deeply without distortion. Imagine a mirror made of still water. If the surface is agitated, you cannot see clearly, but when the water is undisturbed, It reflects the world exactly as it is. Similarly, the silent mind is a mirror in which reality is revealed. The story of the restless bird. Permit me to share a small story. There was once a tiny bird who lived in a bustling forest from dawn to dusk. The bird was in motion, singing, flying, gathering food, escaping predators. Its wings were always fluttering, its heart always racing. One day, exhausted from ceaseless activity, the bird perched on a high branch that overlooked a quiet lake. The moment it stopped moving, it noticed something strange. The lake was perfectly still, not a single ripple. For the first time, the bird saw its own reflection. It had flown through the forest for years, yet had never really seen itself. You see, when movement stops externally or internally only, then can we observe ourselves as we truly are. The bird did not try to make the lake still. It simply became still itself, and the reflection appeared. The beauty of that moment was not in the bird or the lake, but in the meeting of the two in gentle stillness. Our minds are very much like that bird, always in motion, always in pursuit, always escaping. And perhaps, if for a single moment we truly stop, the reflection of the awakened mind may reveal itself. Why are we afraid of silence? Have you asked yourself why silence feels uncomfortable? Why a moment of quiet can feel threatening? When you sit alone without noise, your own thoughts begin to speak louder. Your own anxieties rise like shadows on a wall. So we turn on music. We scroll endlessly. We fill every gap with stimulation. But this only postpones the inevitable. The fear is not of silence itself, but of what silence reveals. Silence is a mirror, and many of us are afraid to see what is reflected there. Our loneliness, our wounds, our longings, our contradictions. But understand this: it is only in the seeing that transformation begins. You cannot heal something you refuse to look at. So silence is not the enemy. Silence is the doorway. The weight of memory. The mind is deeply conditioned by memory. Every experience becomes a mark. Every hurt becomes a scar. Every success becomes a craving for more. We carry our past like a bag of stones over our shoulders. Each stone is a belief, an image, a conclusion. We do not realize how heavy it is because we have carried it for so long. But when the mind becomes silent, that weight begins to loosen. And then you ask, what am I when I am not defined by my past? What am I without my name, my labels, my stories? What remains when all the noise subsides? These are not questions to answer intellectually. They are questions to observe from a space of stillness. And if you stay with them not, trying to resolve them, they open something vast within you. The door that opens by itself. Perhaps you have walked through an automatic door. You approach it, and without pushing, the door slides open. Silence is very much like that. You cannot push your way into it. You cannot force it. You cannot bargain with it. But when you approach quietly, attentively, without expectation, the door opens. Behind that door lies a mind that is fresh, unburdened, awake. A mind capable of love, not the sentimental love of dependency, but the love that arises when fear ends. Such love is part of the awakened mind, and it can only flower in silence. Let us walk further. So, my friends, let us continue walking, not rushing, not trying to arrive, but moving gently, with awareness into the deeper layers of silence. For what lies ahead is not mystical, not secret, not special. It is simply what you already are, beneath the noise, beneath the conditioning, beneath the endless movement of thought. The awakened mind is not something to achieve. It is something to uncover. And as we go deeper, perhaps you will sense that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different kind of listening. A listening that reaches the very depth of your being. And as we move deeper together, let us pause not to analyze, not to judge, but simply to sense this movement of inquiry unfolding in real time. For the mind that observes without choosing is like a flame in a windless room. It illuminates without flickering. It sees without distortion. And in that clarity, something subtle begins to shift. Imagine a vast field on a quiet morning, the grass unmoving, the sky freshly washed by dawn. There is a stillness so complete that even a single leaf trembling becomes a universe of sound. In such stillness, perception sharpens. The smallest movement becomes a revelation. The faintest sound becomes intimate. Each moment becomes alive with meaning. This inner field exists within each of us, but we rarely visit it because the pathways leading there are overgrown with habit, the habit of worrying, the habit of planning, the habit of endlessly becoming. And when you step into it without effort, without method, you begin to perceive life, not through the filters of memory, but with a freshness untouched by yesterday. That freshness is the beginning of awakening. Let us observe something very simple together. A thought arises. Perhaps it is about your past, perhaps about your plans, perhaps about someone you love or fear. The thought appears, and with it comes a feeling, a memory, a reaction. Now ask yourself, who is the observer of this thought? Is the observer separate from the thought, or is the observer itself part of the thinking? When you see directly, not theoretically, that the observer is the thought, that realization ends the division within. It is this division that creates conflict. The division between I and my thoughts, between the thinker and the thought, between what is and what should be. When this false division ends, the mind becomes still, not because it has been forced into silence, but because it sees the futility of conflict. The ending of conflict is silence. There was once a sculptor who traveled far in search of the perfect stone. He wandered from mountain to mountain, carrying tools on his back, convinced that only a flawless block of marble could contain the masterpiece he envisioned. After years of searching, his body grew weary and his spirit heavy. One day, he found himself near a riverbed where countless stones lay weathered and irregular. Out of exhaustion, he sat upon one of them. As his hand rested on its rough surface, he felt something, an unexpected gentleness. He looked closely and saw that despite its imperfections, the stone had a quiet beauty shaped by chimney softened by water. At that moment he realized the mistake of his long journey. He had been searching for perfection, but failing to see beauty. And so he began carving, not imposing an image upon the stone, but allowing its natural shape to guide his hands. And the sculpture that emerged was more alive, more truthful than anything he had forced upon perfect marble. Our minds are like that stone, weathered, imperfect, marked by experience. And silence does not carve us into something ideal. It allows what is true to reveal itself naturally, without force. Fear thrives in noise, in the noise of expectation, of comparison, of uncertainty. Have you noticed how fear grows when the mind begins imagining? It projects, anticipates, exaggerates. It creates scenarios that may never happen, yet the body trembles as if they were happening now. Fear is born of thought. Thought is born of memory. Therefore, fear is always from the past, though it appears as a concern for the future. But when the mind is fully attentive to this moment, not the next, fear cannot take root. This is why silence matters, not because silence is peaceful, but because silence is free from time. When the mind is not slipping into the past and not chasing the future, the movement of fear loses its soil, and in that rootless state, fear ends. Do you see what an extraordinary thing this is? A mind free of fear is a mind free to love, free to create, free to live without burden. Such a mind is awakened. Have you ever listened to someone with complete attention, not thinking of your response, not judging, not agreeing or disagreeing, but listening as though the words were raindrops falling upon a still lake? Such listening itself is a form of silence, for in that moment, the me, with all its opinions and reactions, is absent. In the absence of the me, there is only listening. Most relationships suffer because we do not listen. We hear the words, but not the meaning. We listen through filters, through expectation, through fear, through desire. Silence removes these filters. It allows the mind to hear the heart of another human being. It allows empathy to flower naturally, and in that flowering, relationship becomes something wholly different, something alive, dynamic, unburdened by the past. Relationships are mirrors. They reveal our hidden fears, our desires, our insecurities. Most avuzuzi relationships to escape loneliness, to fill an inner emptiness. But when we use another for comfort, we are not in relationship with them. We are in relationship with our own needs. Have you seen a child grasp a toy tightly, refusing to let go? It clings because the toy represents security. But in that very act of clinging, the child cannot play freely. We cling to people in the same way, to partners, to friends, to mentors. And in clinging, we lose the ability to love. Silence is the space in which relationship becomes clear. When the mind is silent, you can see your attachments without judgment, your fears without escape, your loneliness without resistance. This seeing is the beginning of freedom, and in freedom, love becomes possible. Perhaps you ask, how can I live in silence when the world around me is full of noise, deadlines, obligations, chaos? Silence is not the absence of activity. It is the absence of inner conflict. You can be silent while walking through a crowded street. You can be silent while working, while speaking, even while facing difficulty. Silence is not withdrawal. Silence is clarity. Imagine standing in the center of a spinning carousel. Everything around you moves rapidly. The lights, the music, the people. But the center is still. In the same way, the awakened mind is still at its center, even while life moves with great speed around it. When the center is quiet, the movement of life no longer overwhelms you. You act without confusion, speak without fear, respond without the burden of memory. Silence does not isolate you from life. It allows you to meet life completely. Have you noticed that the present moment carries no weight? It is fresh, unburdened, unconditioned. It is thought that gives it weight, thought that drags the past into the present and projects the future onto the now. Imagine carrying a bag of stones everywhere you go. You walk with it, work with it, sleep with it. One day you realize you can simply set it down. And when you do, you ask, why did I carry this for so long? Not because someone told you to, not because you forced yourself to, but because you saw the unnecessary burden of it. When the mind sees clearly, it lets go naturally. And in that letting go, life becomes incredibly light. A door opens further. So, my friends, let us continue walking deeper into this exploration. The mind is vast, layered, intricate, and silence reveals its depths with extraordinary gentleness. For beyond the stillness of thought lies something even more profound, a silence that is not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something immeasurable, timeless, sacred, not in the religious sense, but in the sense of that which cannot be touched by fear or desire. We shall move into that in the next part, not through belief, but through direct perception. And as we continue, notice how each step inward is not a movement toward isolation, but a movement toward wholeness. For in silence, we begin to meet the totality of our existence, the light and the shadow, the known and the unknown, the visible and the hidden currents of the mind. To go into silence is to enter the vast ocean of one's own consciousness, and we are just beginning to sense its depth. Stand by the seashore for a moment in your imagination. The surface is restless. Waves rise, fall, crash, roar. If you judge the ocean by the surface, you would think it is always in turmoil. But deep below, far beneath the movement of waves, the water is quiet, still, unmoving. Thought is like the waves, constantly rising and falling, but consciousness, the totality of the mind, is far deeper than thought. Most of us live only on the surface. We are tossed by waves of emotion, buffeted by storms of anxiety, pulled by currents of desire. But silence invites us to dive beneath the surface. And when we do, a different dimension of the mind reveals itself, a depth untouched by the storms above. This depth is the ground of the awakened mind. Have you ever experienced a moment when time seemed to disappear? Perhaps while watching a sunset, or listening to a piece of music so beautiful that the world briefly stopped, or in a moment of danger when thought became utterly still and action flowed without hesitation. In such moments, the me, with all its worries and memories, is absent. There is only the purity of perception, a direct contact with life. This is not mystical. It is not something reserved for sages or saints. It happens to all of us. But we rarely notice it because we immediately return to the chatter of thought. Silence is the doorway through which the mind steps into the timeless. And in the timeless, there is no fear, no struggle, no becoming. There is only being. The mind is a creature of habit. It moves along familiar paths, repeating the same patterns, seeking comfort in what it knows. But the known is always the past, and when the mind is bound to the past, it cannot perceive the new. Look at a child discovering something for the first time. Their eyes are bright, their movements spontaneous. There is no fear of being wrong, no hesitation born from memory. Silence has the same quality. It frees the mind from the known, not by erasing memory, but by loosening its grip. When memory loses its authority, perception becomes fresh, and in that freshness, the extraordinary can reveal itself in the ordinary. A leaf fluttering in the breeze can become a revelation. The sound of water can become a doorway. The movement of your own breathing can become the entry point into a dimension of profound stillness. Let me share another small story. There was a traveler who walked through a dense forest at night. To see the path, he carried a lantern. The circle of light showed him the ground beneath his feet, but beyond that circle, darkness stretched endlessly. One night, a storm blew in. The wind grew fierce. Rain lashed against the trees, and suddenly the lantern's flame went out. The traveler panicked at first. He fumbled with the lantern, shaking it, shielding it, desperate to relight the flame. But no matter what he did, the rain extinguished it again and again. Finally, exhausted, he stopped, and in that stillness, his eyes began to adapt. Slowly, shapes emerged from the darkness, the outline of trees, the glimmer of wet leaves, the faint path beneath his feet. He realized that the lantern, which he believed was essential for seeing, had actually limited his vision. For the first time, he saw the forest as it truly was: vast, mysterious, not confined to the circle of artificial light. Our thoughts are like that lantern. We believe they help us see, but often they limit the vastness of our perception. Silence extinguishes the lantern of thought, and then the mind begins to see beyond its own boundaries. When the mind is silent, a particular quality of presence appears, a presence that observes without choosing, without judging, without the slightest desire to interfere. This choiceless awareness is the essence of the awakened mind. In choiceless awareness, there is no center from which the mind observes. There is only observation, just as a clear, polished mirror reflects whatever stands before it without preference, without distortion, without commentary. So the silent mind reflects life. You see anger as anger, fear as fear, joy as joy, not resisting, not labeling, simply seeing. And in the simple act of seeing, a transformation occurs, not because you intend to change, but because observation itself has a transformative power. Have you noticed how a shadow disappears when you bring it into the light? Awareness is that light. There is a profound difference between loneliness and aloneness. Loneliness is the pain of not being connected. It is born from comparison, from the fear of being unloved, from the desire to cling to another. Aloneness is entirely different. It is a state of wholeness, a state in which the mind is not fragmented, not seeking, not escaping. In silence, you begin to understand this difference. When the noise of craving ends, the mind discovers that it is whole in itself, not dependent on another for completion, not using others as escape. This wholeness is aloneness, and in aloneness, love is possible, because love is not born from need. Love flows without effort when the mind is whole. Deep in silence, there is something like a flame, a light not physical, not mystical, but a clarity that illuminates everything it touches. This inner light perceives without confusion. It sees the false as false, and the true as true. It does not seek guidance, because it is its own guide. It does not seek authority, because it is its own authority. And this inner light, this clarity, is not something to be cultivated. It appears naturally when the mind is free of its own noise. Imagine a window covered with dust. The sunlight outside is always shining, but the dust prevents it from entering fully. Silence does not create the sunlight. It simply removes the dust. Consider the flute. It produces music only because it is empty. If it were filled, if it clung to anything inside, no sound could pass through. The mind is like that flute. When it is empty, empty of conclusions, empty of fears, empty of the relentless noise of becoming, then the music of life flows through it naturally. This emptiness is not a void. It is fullness unburdened by the past. And in that fullness, there is beauty. As we go deeper still, you may notice that silence has a peculiar quality, a sense of sacredness. Not sacred in the religious sense, not something invented by belief, not something created by ritual, but sacred in the sense of the immeasurable, the undefinable, the vast and profound mystery of existence. When the mind becomes still, it becomes part of that mystery. It moves with it, breathes with it, lives in communion with it. Every leaf, every movement of wind, every breath you take becomes part of an extraordinary wholeness. This is not something to be imagined. It is not something to seek. It arises naturally when the mind is completely silent. Silence opens the door, and the awakened mind steps through. We continue into the deepest silence. And now, as we approach the final movement of this exploration, we stand on the threshold of something immense, a silence that is not merely the end of noise, but the beginning of a different dimension of being. In the final part, we shall step into that dimension together, not through words alone, but through the depth of attention. And now, as we enter this final movement together, let us move gently, as one steps into a temple of great quiet, where even a single breath carries the weight of eternity. All that we have explored so far, the noise of thought, the turbulence of the mind, the awakening of attention, the depth beneath the waves, has brought us to this threshold. But what lies beyond the threshold cannot be taught. It can only be discovered, not by following, not by imitating, not by believing, but by seeing. We often think silence must be achieved, that we must work toward it, discipline ourselves into it, polish the mind until it becomes still. But silence is not the end of effort. Silence is the absence of effort. Effort, the struggle to become something, to reach something, to attain something, is itself a noise. A very subtle noise, but noise nonetheless. When effort ends, when the mind stops chasing its own projections, silence appears like a bird that lands only on a branch that does not tremble. You cannot hold out your hand and force a wild bird to come, but if you sit quietly, without expectation, the bird may arrive. Silence is that wild visitor. It comes when you are not waiting for it. There is a flame that burns only when fed with fuel, the fuel of desire, of ambition, of fear, of longing. But there is another flame that burns without fuel. It is the flame of pure awareness. It does not consume anything. It does not depend on thought. It does not rise or fall. It simply is. When the mind is silent, this flame becomes visible, not as something extraordinary, but as the most natural thing in the world. It is like discovering, after a long journey in darkness, that the sun has been shining the whole time. You were merely walking with your eyes closed. The awakened mind is the opening of the eyes. There is a ground upon which the movement of life unfolds, a ground that is not touched by joy or sorrow, not altered by success or failure, not shaken by gain or loss. It is the ground of being. When the mind is silent, it comes into contact with this ground, not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as a direct perception. It is like touching the earth with bare feet after years of walking on stone. Suddenly, you feel something real, something living, something immeasurably ancient. This ground is what remains when fear ends, when memory loosens its grip, when time loses its authority. It is always present, but we overlook it because we are busy chasing shadows cast by our own thoughts. Silence reveals the ground upon which the self dissolves and only being remains. Have you noticed that every ending contains a beginning? When a leaf falls, it nourishes the soil. When the night ends, the dawn begins. When a wave breaks upon the shore, it returns to the vast sea. The ending of the self, the psychological self, the me woven from memory and desire, is not a loss. It is the beginning of freedom. But this ending cannot be forced. It happens naturally when the mind sees the totality of itself. Seeing is ending. Ending is the beginning, and from that beginning flows a life untouched by fear, a life free from the burden of becoming. Let me share a final story with you. A man was rowing across a lake in thick morning fog. As he glided peacefully, another boat suddenly collided with his. His anger rose instantly. He shouted into the mist, "What's wrong with you? Watch where you're going." The fog thinned, and he saw the boat was empty. No one had been steering it. The wind had simply carried it toward him. Without a person to blame, his anger dissolved. What had changed? Not the event, but the perception. When the self is absent, anger has no place to land. Fear has nothing to cling to. Hurt finds no residence. We discover that most of our suffering is born of the imagined other, created by a mind that feels separate. Silence reveals that there is no other. The boat is empty. And in that realization, peace flows like a river. When the mind is silent, love appears. Not the love of possession, not the love that seeks comfort, not the love that fluctuates with mood and circumstance, but the love that exists without motive, without condition, without fear. Love is the fragrance of silence. It arises when the self is absent, when the mind is not searching, when the heart is free to give without asking anything in return. Such love is not directed toward one person. It is like sunlight. It shines because it is its nature to shine. In silence, the mind becomes a garden. And in that garden, love flowers without effort. The awakened mind has no center, no point from which it judges, compares, calculates, protects. It moves from emptiness, not a barren emptiness, but a fullness beyond measure. When there is no center, there is no conflict. When there is no conflict, there is no fear. When there is no fear, there is freedom. And in freedom, action is precise. Thought is simple. Relationship is clear. You become like a clear sky. Clouds may pass, storms may arise, but the sky itself is untouched. This untouched space is the awakened mind. Silence is not confined to meditation, to still rooms, to moments of solitude. Silence can walk with you through the marketplace, through your work, through your relationships, through the inevitable challenges of living. It is a clarity that accompanies action, a light that illuminates each step, a presence that listens without judgment, responds without fear, lives without division. When silence becomes part of your being, life itself becomes your meditation. Every breath becomes a teacher. Every moment becomes a door. And you step through these doors without hesitation, without conflict, without seeking, for the seeker has vanished. Only seeing remains. A final invitation, my friends. We have walked a long way together, through the forests of thought, across the rivers of fear, into the open field of silence. But the real journey begins where these words end. If you truly listen, not to my voice, but to your own inward movements, you will find that silence is already there, waiting patiently beneath the surface. You need not seek it. You need not chase it. Simply look. Simply listen. Simply be. And in that simple being, the awakened mind reveals itself not as something distant, but as your own true nature. There is a silence so deep, so immense, so overflowing with life, that to enter it is to be reborn moment by moment. Step into that silence. Let it wash over you. Let it dissolve the boundaries of the self. Let it show you what it means to live fully. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now, This very moment is the doorway to awakening. Walk through it